On the next episode of Footnote, we welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning author Isabel Wilkerson to discuss her groundbreaking work, The Warmth of Other Suns.
The book is about the greatest migration within the borders of our own country, and the story in the book is told through the lives of three people who represent each of these migration streams.
It's all coming up on the next episode of Footnote. Welcome to Footnote and the A&T Bookstore in Clifton, New Jersey. I'm your host, Kimberly Austin. Author Isabel Wilkerson joins us today to talk about her book, The Warmth of Other Suns. It's a sweeping human story of people following their hearts to escape a brutal caste system in the American South and to find freedom within the borders of their own country. Welcome, Isabel.
Thank you.
Well, first tell us what the book's about.
The book is about this migration, the greatest migration within the borders of our own country. It began in 1915 and ended in 1970, and it involved 6 million African Americans who migrated from the South to all points north and west. There were three major streams of this migration from up the East Coast, from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, up to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, here in New Jersey, to New York, and all up to Boston. There was a second stream, which was from Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee, up to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, the Midwest, and then the final stream was from Texas and Louisiana out to California and just the entire West Coast. This was in many ways a defection from a caste system which we know as Jim Crow, and the story in the book is told through the lives of three people who represent each of these migration streams throughout the United States, and they're just beautiful people, and you follow their journey from start to finish.
What's the significance of the title? There's actually a lovely passage in the beginning of the book, if you'd love to read that for us.
Yes, the title comes from a passage from Richard Wright, who was one of the great novelists of the 20th century. He wrote Native Son, and he was also one of the best-known people who participated in this great migration. He wrote a passage in his autobiography which in some ways speaks to the yearning of anyone who ever left a place, the only place that they'd ever known, for a place that they'd never seen, in hopes that life would be better. And he wrote, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom."
Isabel, this is also a very personal story for you. Your parents were part of the Great Migration. Tell us about their experience.
Yes, my mother migrated from Rome, Georgia to Washington, D.C., and my father migrated in a different decade from Southern Virginia to Washington, D.C., where they met and married, and they had come from two different parts of the South, so they would never, ever have met had there been no Great Migration. So that means that I would never have existed, which is very similar to the experiences of most Americans, if you think about it. So many people have a great-grandmother who came from Ireland and who met a great-grandfather who was from Italy. They meet in New York or in Chicago, and there you have a whole new lineage forming here in the United States. And so in some ways, so many of us owe our very existence to the fact that somebody did what the people in this book did. Somebody in all of our backgrounds had to have done that in order for us to exist, actually.
What kind of stories did they relate to you? How did they feel about the Great Migration?
Well, an interesting thing about the Great Migration, or this whole period in history, and why I wanted to write the book, is because people didn't talk about it. Life had been so difficult for them where they had come from. that they often just, when they left, they put it behind them and never spoke of it to their children and grandchildren. And so I didn't grow up hearing these stories. I only discovered them in the course of researching the book, believe it or not.
And it is an amazing book. And when we come back, we'll actually be introduced for the first time to the three main characters of the book, George, Ida, and Robert. We'll be right back. And we're back talking with author Isabel Wilkerson about her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, and a story that most of us don't or know very little about.
Even the people participating in it, even the children.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. As you said, you were a child of the Great Migration, and you were very rarely told the stories as well.
Didn't talk about it.
What kind of environment did people leave behind, Isabel?
That's one of the reasons why they didn't talk about it. The world that they left was in some ways a caste system in which there were fixed roles for everyone who was in that world. There were specific rules that dictated the lives of both blacks and whites in every aspect, every sphere of life. For example, it was against the law in Birmingham for a black person and a white person to play checkers together. It was against the law. There were, throughout the South, in courtrooms, was a black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on. That meant that when a white person took the stand, there was one Bible that was brought out for them to swear to tell the truth. And if a black person took the stand, they had to get a separate Bible for them because they couldn't touch the same Bible. And of course, it was a world, a caste system that was enforced with great brutality, because every 4 days during that era, there was a black person lynched somewhere in the South. That's incredible when you think about it. And that was because something like that is kind of an unnatural state of being, to have people so limited in what they could do. That it would have to be maintained with that kind of enforcement.
And in fact, lynching is what George, the first character that we'll talk about, that's what he was escaping.
He was escaping the very strong likelihood that he would have been. And that was because George Starling had gone to school. He had the opportunity to go get a couple years of college, and then the money ran out. He was from Florida, living in Central Florida. And when the money ran out, he had to return to the work of the people in the neighborhood, or the part of Florida that he was from. And that meant picking citrus fruit. But when he got back to the groves after having been in college, he started to be able to be aware that they were being cheated on so many levels. That work was very dangerous. They had to climb into 40-foot trees. People would fall out of the tree, break a limb. It was very dangerous work, and they were being cheated. They were being paid maybe 10 cents for a box of fruit that would go out on the open market for $4. And so he began to try to negotiate for higher wages and better working conditions for them. And for doing that, he ended up having to flee for his life, and he headed to New York, Harlem, in 1945.
Now, Ida May, the female character of our book, tell us about her.
Ida May Gladney was a sharecropper's wife in Mississippi, and she was terrible at picking cotton. I mean, who even thinks about someone being good or bad at it? Well, she was really bad at it, and she would tell you, I could never pick 100 pounds to save my life, she would say. And she didn't apologize for it. She said, I'm not good at it. And but her family ended up having to leave because a cousin was beaten to within an inch of his life over a theft that he did not commit. The thing that they thought he had stolen actually turned up the next day. But by then he had been beaten almost nearly to death. And when her husband saw the condition that his cousin was in, he came home and he told her right then and there, this is the last crop we're making. And they set out on a course for the North, which was first Milwaukee and then to Chicago. They couldn't leave immediately, and they could not let anyone know that they were about to leave.
Because there did come a point when people did start to realize this was an exodus of some kind, and so you had to make these very covert plans. And Robert, our final character, and when you tell Robert's story, please don't leave out the part of how you recreated his journey.
Yes, Robert Joseph Pershing Foster was a surgeon who had been a captain in the Army and had performed surgery in the Army. When he got out of the Army after the Korean War, it turned out he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. And so he decided to set out on a course for California, which had been the American dream from his perspective. And he decided he was going to drive. He had a family already, but he decided he was going to go out first, scope it out, and get situated before he would send for them. And so he had to make this drive from Louisiana to Los Angeles, which meant that he was going to have to go through the desert, through the mountains, through huge states. You know, the western states are countries unto themselves. And he got to a certain point where he thought he was well past the Jim Crow laws that would have said he would not have been able to stop, get gas maybe, get food, or stop at a motel where they would not take him. He thought he was well past it. He was even past New Mexico. And he needed to stop for the night, and he could not find a motel that would allow him to rent a room. That is a journey that I set out to recreate myself. I had my parents in the car. They were retired and always up for an adventure. And we rented a Buick, as he had. He had a Buick Roadmaster, which he was driving, and he said, if you had seen it, you would want it too. And I had told my parents that I must do the driving. I wanted to be able to see what is it like when you're gripping the wheel for so long that your fingers almost begin to lock in place, and that your eyes grow so heavy from the lack of sleep that they begin to ache. And I told them that they couldn't drive. I had to do all the driving as he had. We got to the part in Arizona where the land begins to turn rugged in unexpected ways, and their hairpin turns. It was nighttime. I'd been driving for hours and hours and hours, and it was a long, long way still to the coast. And I began to veer from the road, and my parents said, please stop the car. At this point, there are many places that we could stop. They had lived through Jim Crow, and they said, you know, we've lived through it. It's really not necessary to go through this, and let's stop the car. And if you won't stop, let us out, was almost what they wanted to say. And so we stopped. We had no trouble finding a room, because that shows you how very far we've come as a country. It was no longer 1953. And we found a room with no trouble. And I felt very disheartened, actually, because of it, because I knew he had not had that option. He didn't have a cell phone. There were no cell phones. He didn't have GPS. He didn't have satellite radio. He didn't have all the things that we take for granted, and he could not find a room to rest on top of all that. So it really made me feel for him.
Well, when we come back, actually, we will talk more about the situation that they had in the South, then when they got to the North, and how surprised they may have been to see what the situation really was like when they got there. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with Isabel Wilkerson about her wonderful book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And Isabel, your writing is so palpable. When you tell the stories of these people, I really feel like I'm reliving their experience. Thank you for doing that. I actually was going to ask you next if the people in the book were surprised by the level of racism that they found in the North versus what they were coming from. But you've told me you don't like the word racism and you don't use it. Tell me about that.
Their expectations were so modest. Once they got there, they were not looking to become, CEOs of big Fortune 500 companies and to own skyscrapers. They were merely looking for the opportunity to be able to walk down the street without having to step off the sidewalk, to be able to go into a restaurant and be served. They had such modest goals that actually the idea of whatever they were to have met, I don't think that they were as surprised as some people might have thought. And it was a measure of relative freedom in the North and the West for them. The reason that I don't use what I call the R word is because I don't want, first of all, I like the idea of thinking of this as a caste system that doesn't personalize it so much, that allows people to see that you have a system in place that was necessary, although not humane. In other words, and it's hard to maneuver for anyone. And I like the idea of thinking of it as a system, as a structure that everyone is bound up in. And by thinking of it that way, it frees us to think about what really was going on during the 20th century. The focus is on what happened, what did the people endure, what was everyone experiencing during that time.
I can appreciate that. And another word that the actual people who went through the migration don't like to use is an immigration, because this is what's so astounding. This was in our own country. These were already citizens of this country. It's mind-boggling at times. How did they describe this?
They actually didn't describe themselves as anything, which is part of the reason why it hadn't been written about. And so they didn't think of it as a mass movement at the time. It's only with the benefit of hindsight that we can now put this all together and say that there were 6 million people who participated in this mass movement. We can only say that in hindsight, but they never called themselves that. They didn't call themselves migrants. They didn't call themselves part of the Great Migration. They certainly did not call themselves immigrants. They do not like the term immigrants. Seeking political asylum within their own country. It's a tragedy that they had to do that. And so their behavior was that of any immigrant. They would double up and triple up in these tenements, just like immigrants do. They would work 2 and 3 jobs, which is what immigrants do. They were sending money back home, which is a hallmark of what almost any immigrant does. And so they were acting like immigrants, but they were not immigrants because they were citizens of this country, so they should not have had to do that. And so it's interesting that a lot of people will recoil, the people who participate in this will recoil at that term. And I totally wholeheartedly agree with them.
And there's other great successes out of the Great Migration, including some very famous people.
Very famous
people.
Tell
us about a few of those people.
In literature, for example, Toni Morrison is one of the best examples because her parents migrated from Alabama to Ohio, where she had the opportunity to actually go into libraries and take out a library book. She would never have been able to do that in the Jim Crow South in Alabama at that time because it was not blacks were prohibited from going into a library, taking out a library book. And one would need to be able to go to a library if you're going to become a Nobel laureate.
That's true.
So her life was totally different than it would have been otherwise. The Jackson family, for example, their mother had come up from Alabama as well, and the father was from Arkansas, and there they met in outside of Chicago. So that just continues on and on. So much of what we take for granted as American culture would not have existed had there been no Great Migration, because these parents who made the decision of their lives, this really frightening decision to leave all that they'd known for this place that they'd never seen, did it ultimately, as many immigrants will, for their children, because they had already lived under and were grown. If they didn't get more than an 8th grade education, it was going to be too late for them, but it wasn't going to be too late for their children. So it's in the children that we can see the full effect of this migration. And so you get an August Wilson, who is one of the great playwrights of the 20th century. And so you get a Lorraine Hansberry, who did A Raisin in the Sun. And you get, in jazz, for example, you get Miles Davis. Jazz wouldn't be what it is today if there had not been a Great Migration. These people I've just mentioned have an international following, not just an American following. They're beloved around the world. And so this was really in some ways a contribution to the world, because it showed that these people who had been held down and held in a fixed place in a caste system in the South, once they got out, were able to flourish and changed American culture as we know it.
And we have you.
Thank you.
And when we come back, we'll talk about where do we go from here. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our chat with author Isabel Wilkerson, author of The Warmth of Other Suns. Isabel, you've said that this story is not really told. It's not even really told by those who lived it. What do you feel the legacy of your book will be?
I hope that the legacy of the book will be that it will prompt more discussion about it and get people to start talking about it, because, first of all, there was a lot of shame and pain and heartache that attended the departures of these people. That what set them off on this journey was often painful. They didn't share it with their children. They absorbed the legacies of being in a caste system, being on the lowest level of a caste system, and they didn't share that with their children out of a lot of pain and hurt. And so I'm hopeful that it will make people feel more comfortable talking about it, make it okay, validate their experiences so they'll be willing to talk about it, and get the children to want to identify with this part of their past, because this is really truly a legacy that's been left by these 6 million people who participated in this Great Migration. And I would hope that one of the things people would do as a result of this book is that they would begin to ask their own parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, or the oldest people in their families, and this would be people of all backgrounds, because all of us share, it's very human to migrate. Migration is just what human beings do. And so my goal would be to try to encourage people, inspire people to talk to the oldest people in their families before it's too late. I have a really keen sense of how if you don't act soon, the stories will be gone. and that's one of the things I hope will come from it.
And how long did it take you to write the book?
It took 15 years, and the first few years were spent just finding the people. That's when I'm going to those quilting clubs and the Catholic churches in Los Angeles and the Baptist churches in New York, wherever I was going. It took a while to find these 3 amazing people, and then once I found them, it took many years of spending time with them, because remember, I'm having to rotate among them and spend as much time as I possibly can to get to know them.
What do you think we all need to learn from this book? Because I think there are many lessons to be learned from this book, but what do you think are the most important ones?
To me, the most important lesson and inspiring thing for me is the fact that this was a leaderless revolution. These 6 million people, by what they did, helped to change the country, the culture as we know it. The people in their hearts decided that they were not going to take that caste system anymore and made the decision of their lives. They didn't look to their leaders. In fact, the leaders told them not to go. The leaders encouraged them to stay and said that, this is the land of the forefathers, this is the land of the ancestors, this is the land that the ancestors worked so hard. Don't leave. This is your mother and father are here. Don't leave. And the people left anyway, by the millions. That means that there's a great deal of courage and strength within all of us. If they could do that with nothing, what is it that those of us living today with so many advantages that they didn't have? It means that there's nothing that we can't do.
Right. Yeah. I think it should be taught in school. I really do. And I have to tell you that I will forever take these people with me. And I'm so glad I didn't cry. The book is just, sometimes left me speechless. It's so touching, so heartwarming, so gut-wrenching. But through it all, the palpability of these people's courage is overwhelming. Isabel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
As Isabel says in the book, over the decades, perhaps the wrong questions have been asked about the Great Migration. Perhaps it is not a question of whether the migrants brought good or ill to the cities they fled to, or were pushed or pulled to their new destinations, but a question of how they summoned the courage to leave in the first place, or how they found the will to press beyond the forces against them, and the faith in a country that had rejected them for so long. By their actions, they did not dream the American dream. They willed it into being by a definition of their own choosing. Thank you for being with us today. I hope you'll join us again next time on Footnote.